This is Dr. Rich Schuttler with lesson number 5, Research Questions and Hypotheses. This is the information you need to know about how to complete the sections in Chapter 3 related to research questions and hypotheses. In this lesson, I will address a quick introduction, the purpose of this lesson, if you will. Then I'll address research questions and hypotheses that you need to have information about in Chapter 3. I'll give some general information about the importance of this information in Chapter 3, and I'll conclude with a reflective summary. As far as an introduction goes, why is this lesson on research questions and hypotheses being included? I believe it's important that you understand that Chapter 3 is about providing details for the reader. This reader may be your proposal or your dissertation chair, could be your committee members, somebody at the university who has to review your work, or a reader 2, 3, maybe 10 years after the time your work is published. Chapter 3 is a critical chapter because, after all, what you're doing is a research study. This is not necessarily a student assignment, but a research study. And Chapter 3 is about methodology. And what you want to be able to do in this chapter is not only indicate that you have knowledge about what you're doing, but you want to give more amplifying information so that other people understand that you're somewhat of an expert in your research method in design. That is expected of a doctorate student upon graduation, that he or she has a certain level of expertise, knowledge on their chosen research method and design, as well as perhaps other areas. And research questions and hypotheses are part of the research alignment. For this section on research questions and hypotheses, it would be found in Chapter 3 after the research method and design section. Much like in Chapter 1, where you have the nature of the study section, then you had research questions and hypotheses. In Chapter 3, the following path would be the same, in the sense that as you have expanded upon the research method and design section in Chapter 3 from Chapter 1, you're going to do somewhat similar work now with the research questions and or the inclusion of hypotheses if you have them in your study. Research questions narrow the focus of a study and allow inquiry into specific areas of the research topic. This was cited from Questwell 2012. In many cases, what you're going to do with your work in Chapter 3 is open your headings or sections with some information to help educate the reader. Help the reader to know that you understand the purpose for the research questions and why they're there. Here in Chapter 3, you're going to write about 2 paragraphs of content about what research questions are for, and you're going to base that on your research method and design. You're going to educate the reader a little bit about why research questions are part of a study, that the research questions, when answered, should provide some information that allows one to make a better decision, in essence, to help lessen the specific problem that you identified in Chapter 1. If you're not sure what research questions are, what their purpose for, or the rationale for them, this is a good time to read more on that. You're going to have to be an expert to understand what research questions are from a research context, from a research perspective, not so much from a general user of research, but get a sense for what research questions really are and their value. And this is what you're going to write about in these 2 paragraphs of content about research questions. And then you're going to provide the research question or research questions at the end after you do about 2 paragraphs of information that informs the reader about what research questions are and how they're applied to your research method and design. Research questions are different in design and in purpose in a qualitative study as compared to a quantitative study. If you're doing a mixed method study, then you're going to have to address both of them, because you are going to have research questions from both the quantitative and qualitative side of the work that you're going to do. When you do this, particularly with the information that you're going to write in those 2 paragraphs, please ground citations from the experts for your research method and design. It's easier to find people who will write about different research methods. But there are people who have specialized in different designs, whether it be phenomenological design or a case study design, or perhaps it's something more related to quantitative causality, for example, cause and effect design. Maybe it's a correlation design. Maybe it's exploratory case study design. What you want to be able to do are find the experts on those methods and designs, but in particular the designs. Now, Creswell has written a lot of books about all the research methods and designs because he writes textbooks. They're more like popular books. Textbooks such as Creswell and a few other books that people use as textbooks for any kind of research method and design are starting to be frowned upon in dissertation work. Ideally, you want to find the expert. If you're going to do something, let's just say phenomenological study, there's an individual named Van Kamp who has a specific method. You would want to focus on a lot of his work. You would also look for current research that's being produced perhaps in the last 3 or 5 years, and find out who else is becoming an expert who has done a lot of work in your research design. One great place to find that information is in your online library. If you go to your online library and look up all the different options you have for the different subscriptions that your library holds, one of them is Sage Research Method Online. I have found this to be very helpful because there you can put in what your research method and design is, and you'll get a lot of information from experts in that area. Also, another great way to find this focused information is go to your local library. Yes, go to your local library and ask a librarian. Don't just try to figure this out yourself. Go to the expert. The expert librarian there will help you save time, and you'll be far more efficient and effective in finding what you need. If you have done all of your work in Chapter 2, or you have a good draft of Chapter 2, I encourage you to quit reading the content about what you're studying and spend more time reading about your research method and design with the focus on your design. You're already an expert in your field of study. If you wrote 30 or more pages in Chapter 2, maybe you're doing some finalizing of it. Sure, maybe you have your Google Alerts set up to give you information on any new publications in the areas of your studying. But now it's time to go and become more of an expert on your research method and design. In regards to research questions, you want to give information in regards to the content supports your knowledge of research questions and how they align with that research method and design. Again, you're going to add value. In those 2 paragraphs I mentioned that are now going to be in Chapter 3 on only research questions and how they are designed, what their purpose are, what the rationale are for your study, you're going to add value. In essence, if you do a qualitative research study, the information you get from open-ended interviews or perhaps by having people in focus groups give you information is going to be information that once consolidated is going to answer your research questions. If you're doing quantitative and you have a Likert type survey, much as I used in my study and I do with many of my clients, the aggregate of all the answers in the Likert type survey, once compiled, go to answer the research questions. Now, first what has to happen in that vein in quantitative is that data from the surveys gets put into testing the null hypothesis, and it's the actual response of the null that answers the research question. Now, you allude to that as well in the hypothesis section if you're doing a quantitative study. Now, talk a little bit about the null hypothesis. I talked first about research questions. Now you're going to state the null hypothesis, and you're going to give, again, another paragraph or 2 about null hypotheses and hypothesis testing. You're going to educate the reader. Remember, this is an academic exercise. You're going to help the reader to understand that you know why you're doing the work. And I'm going to put an emphasis in this lesson about null hypothesis or hypotheses. If your hypothesis is if you only have one, hypotheses if you have more than one. Now, the importance of the null is to know that that's what you're testing. In my students' work, I don't even care if they put the regular or alternative hypothesis. We only talk about the null. If you want to include the regular hypothesis, some call it the alternative hypothesis, or some just call it the hypothesis. That's fine, but it's not needed. With hypotheses, what you're really doing is you're testing these relationships, these testable statements that result in the null hypothesis being rejected or failing to be rejected. It's rejected if the relationship exists, and it fails to reject if it's not. And the result answers its research question. Again, it's beyond the scope of this lesson plan to teach you everything about research questions, hypotheses, but I encourage you to look at it this way. And this might be where you have a pen and paper ready. For every research question in a quantitative study, and because we're talking about hypotheses now, we're only talking about quantitative studies. Or it could be the mixed method, but we're talking about the quantitative portion. Each research question should have one null hypothesis. When you answer the null hypothesis, it allows you then to respond to the research questions. You're actually testing the null hypothesis, and whether you reject it or fail to reject it is what answers the research question. Now, if you have 3 research questions, you'll have 3 null hypotheses. And ideally, you will have one independent variable for every research question. This is what I call a clean study. You'll have one dependent variable, and then let's just say, for example, you have 3 independent variables. Then you're going to have 3 research questions and then 3 null hypotheses. And if you have it designed as such, it makes your study very easy to understand and get through. State why you're testing the null hypothesis. There's a reason why you're testing the null hypothesis, because mathematically you have to test for the null. Again, it's beyond the scope of this lesson for me to teach you the information on how to test for the null, but there's formulas and there's tests to do that with. If you're not sure, I encourage you to hire a statistician or a tutor to help you better understand this. When I was a doctorate student working on my dissertation, I did a mixed method study, and I hired a tutor because I did not learn what I needed to in my classes on research, so I needed to hire somebody to tutor me through it because I couldn't learn it on my own. It was just an area I wasn't that good at. I'm still not that good at it. And when I do research, I have a research partner her name is Dr. Ruby Rouse. She does the research particularly related to the quantitative stuff because she's an expert. And if you're looking for help, send me an email. I'll give you her email address. You might be able to have her tutor you like I had somebody tutor me. When you're testing the null, what statistical test will you apply? And the rationale. In Chapter 3 of your proposal, after you state the hypothesis, in like perhaps the second paragraph, you're going to indicate what statistical tests you plan to employ once you collect the data to be able to test the null hypothesis. You don't have to go into depth on this in Chapter 3 of your proposal, but the people who are going to approve your proposal are going to want to know that you understand when you're going to test the null hypothesis for the type of study you're doing, and that may vary depending on whether you're going to do a correlation design or cause and effect design, depending on what kind of data you have. The important point here is to understand as you're creating Chapter 3, when you state what the value and what the purpose of hypotheses are, then you give your hypothesis, then you give some explanation on what tests you're going to run when your data is collected and the rationale for running those tests. And the rationale should include something to the effect that supports that you're running the statistical test to produce a certain outcome that's going to be able to reject the null or fail to reject the null. And by doing so, you're going to be able to answer the question and therefore be able to provide a response that's going to give you conclusions, implications at the end in Chapter 5 of your dissertation. There's only 2 outcomes, and a lot of times I see students get this wrong. In regards to testing a null hypothesis, you either reject the null or you fail to reject the null. There's nothing about accepting the hypothesis or failing to accept the null. Those words are often used, but if you look at what I'll call the strictest terminology in research context, that researchers will use, they'll talk about rejecting the null or failing to reject the null. Again, if you're not sure about this and it seems a little strange, then I encourage you to go to Sage Online Resources, take a look at some of the books, maybe perhaps find your research teacher that you have had in a class, or go back to the textbooks that you have and read more on this. This will help you become a better expert. Again, if any of the information I'm talking about here is uncertain to you, that should be a trigger that helps you to better understand that if you're doing a quantitative study, you need to get better at developing more expertise in your research design. Answering the research questions. I'll talk about from a qualitative perspective first. When you're doing a qualitative study and you're doing interviews or you're looking at focus groups to determine what's going on, what you're going to be able to get from there are these, what we call assumptions and beliefs, these lived experiences. Qualitative work is often based on people's lived experiences. So if I had a research question, I might ask, what are the assumptions of K through 12 teachers about whatever the situation is you're studying in a Boston, Massachusetts school? The point being is that you're going to ask what the assumptions are. You may have a research questions that ask them what their beliefs are. If they happen to be in leadership positions and you're asking about how subordinates perform, you may ask what people believe, and that could be based on their philosophies that they have and how they were brought up. You might be asking about perceptions or what are their understandings, or if it's a case study perhaps and you're exploring something and how something happened and you have a group of people that are going to give you information about how a process was run. These are all things from exploratory or explanatory type, or they're going to describe what they believe they saw or what they believe to be true. In this case, when you start to look at answering the research questions, you literally have to ask the people, what do they assume? What are their assumptions, or what are their perceptions about their lived experiences? Then you put all that information from each person who answered the same questions and you put it into, let's just say, for example, a software called NVivo software, which helps produce any common themes or nodes. And ideally, you want to be able to write in Chapter 3 for a qualitative study, much like I mentioned a few seconds about in a quantitative study, that you would have to be able to give information that's going to answer the research questions. This is going to be the same here, where you're going to indicate in your research questions how the data analysis will be performed once the data is collected to be able to answer the research questions. Oftentimes you're talking about lived experiences. You may have to have 2 or 3 individual questions that are research questions in your study, one that deals with what their assumptions are, what their perceptions, and perhaps what are their values or their beliefs, one for each individual item. It wouldn't be very easy to answer a question if your research question was, what are the assumptions, beliefs, and values of the K through 12 teachers in Boston, Massachusetts? Because assumptions, perceptions, and beliefs are different items. From a quantitative perspective, when you're talking about answering the research questions, you're going to do that statistical testing that I mentioned. Because the null hypothesis, the outcome, really helps to predict something in relation to a correlation design or offers cause and effect. As you start to develop your testing for the null hypothesis, really what you're doing is you're looking to predict something or impact some sort of testing from a cause and effect relationship, that something when A happened impact B somehow, some way, much like cause and effect in your automobile. There's a cause that may happen reflecting on why your car won't start. It could be one of many things. It could be the battery, it could be bad gas, it could be the solenoid is dead. These cause and effect relationships are answered differently than a correlation type answer would be. Because what you're looking for in most cases is to what extent or to what degree is there a correlation or is there a cause and effect. When we understand what the extent is, then we're able to then statistically test it from all the people, complete out your Likert type surveys, and then you put all that information, you consolidate to run your statistical test to be able to what? Yes, reject or failed to reject the null hypothesis. Chapter 3, as I mentioned in the other lessons, is to show your discerning knowledge of research. Now, in this lesson, we're talking about just research questions and hypotheses. So it's important that you have a couple paragraphs for each, and you indicate what the purpose of research questions are for, particularly as they relate to your design. Then offer what your research question is, or how many you have. It could be how many there are, and then how you're going to answer them. Remember, you have to be a subject matter expert. You have to develop a certain amount of expertise. You don't have to be like somebody who does research for a living. Nobody expects that. But we do expect some subject matter expertise, that you know enough about your research method and design so that if you should happen to be in an academic discourse amongst your peers after you graduate and they ask you questions about, in this case, let's just say about your research questions, what was your central research question and why did you develop your question that way and how did you answer it, that you'll be able to do so in a professional manner that will bring great credit upon you as well as the university. The end result for Chapter 3 is to inform others, particularly the readers of your work. That may be your dissertation chair and committee member. It could also be people later, years down the line, who are unknowable who will read your work. If your work is truly significant and substantial, if you add value to your work and you make it something that people will want to read because there's something in your work they could use, then people will read your work. When you go the extra level and include, in this case, why you have research questions, what their purpose are, what they are, and then the rationale for asking them the way you are, then you add more value to your work. And this goes into providing those details that I've always talked about in Chapter 3. And what kind of details are those? Yep, those excruciating details. Just keep in mind, details, details, details. Somebody says you need to write about your research questions and hypotheses in Chapter 3, know that that's general guidance. Then it's up to you to help the reader understand why you have written your questions the way they have. Now, you may have to get into the level of depth where it provides information how each research question came to be. In essence, how it was born. For example, each research question should be born out of the data or the analysis of Chapter 2 that you did. Ideally, research questions are designed to close the gap in the literature, to give something worth studying. It may be related to your problem statement. In a later lesson in this program, I'll give information on how you might go about doing that. But as you start to write this section in particular about research questions, it's not going to be enough just to say what they are. You're going to have to ground them on how they came to be. That's the rationale. If you're doing one research question for each independent variable, you're going to give some evidence on how your research question was born from the information of the body of knowledge about your independent variable. To conclude this lesson, as far as a reflective summary, I gave you some general information just to help you perhaps better understand how much information or how much value you need to write in your Chapter 3 related to research questions and hypotheses. Remember, you want to give some general information about what research questions hypotheses are, then state yours, and then state the rationale for how you came up with what you have. And that rationale may include going back and tracking how each research question ties back to the literature. Now that will be true whether it's a quantitative or correlation study. Research questions should not be just ones that you think are the best ones to ask off the top of your head because you're an expert. It's nice that you're an expert. We understand that everybody is an expert in what they're studying. After all, you wouldn't be studying if you were an expert. But the point being is you have to ground each research question and substantiate that, and that's what the value comes out in Chapter 3 when you start writing about your research questions. And I gave you some general information just about the importance of Chapter 3. Again, the time to build in the quality of your work is now early on while you're developing Chapter 3. You should constantly ask yourself, how can I add even more value to Chapter 3? How can I create truly a significant, substantial doctoral dissertation that you're going to be proud of, the university staff will be proud of, and people will want to read your work? And I can guarantee you, if you do a great dissertation, people will want to read your work. Education, much like your chapter 3, is a lot like life, that the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. I've been spending a lot of time in these lessons in chapter 3 just trying to help you better understand what kind of content, what kind of level of content needs to go in chapter 3. Again, it's beyond the scope of me to be able to teach you everything you need to know about research questions, hypothesis. You've already had research classes, or you'll have more classes on it. If you need a tutor or you need to go to the library, then of course that's what you need to do to build up that expertise. I'm Dr. Rich Shuttler. You can find more information about me on my website. You can also find information about my membership site, which is called Professional Progress Academy, which is where much of the information about taking the BIAB ABD program will be focused and provided. I hope you enjoy this lesson.